Jason Brennan is a philosophy PhD from the University of Arizona and is the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. I can see that Georgetown and SMU share an affinity for extraordinarily long titles. I don't know about yours, but I used to say that my title, each word of my title was $1 million donation. So I'm imagining that's the same for yours, Jason. He specializes, as you can tell, in politics, philosophy, and economics. He's the editor of Public Affairs Quarterly, associate editor of Social Philosophy and Policy, and is currently overseeing a over $2 million grant on markets, social entrepreneurship, and effective altruism, funded by the John Templeton Foundation. He is the author of over 50 academic articles and 16 books at least. I think it's more than that now, but it's a moving target with Jason. My favorite book of his is Why It's Okay to Be Rich, which we've had our undergraduate reading group students read. Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education, which made him very popular at Georgetown, I imagine. Against Democracy, another provocative title, and another one, Why Not Capitalism? So as you can tell, Jason is not afraid to use provocative titles and write provocative works. Tonight, the Bridwell Institute is pleased to be releasing his latest study, the title of which is The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Dilemma, The Wrong Reasons or the Wrong Kind, copies of which are throughout the room. With that, please welcome Jason Brennan.
Thanks very much. It's good to be back here at SMU. In fact, I was just remembering that the first talk I ever gave as a graduate student was actually here in the philosophy department for a conference. So, it's nice to return, but I've been here a couple more times since then. Bob set it up as me being very provocative, but I guess I'm not going to be that provocative tonight. I was told I sent this paper out to the Journal of Business Ethics, who's publishing it, and the referees all said I was being too friendly and too calm, and I really should go for the jugular, which I've never gotten as a comment before, ever, for any reason. So I was really surprised by that. You can see whether you agree. So this is what this paper is about. It's about diversity, equity, inclusion, in particular diversity, and two different kinds of arguments people make on behalf of it. And they make them at the same time. And they think, the more arguments, the merrier. But the problem is the reasons people give for diversity might sometimes come into conflict. The kinds of things you need to do in response to it might come into conflict. That doesn't sound true at first glance, but when we go into it, we're going to see there's something really weird going on here. Making two different kinds of argument at the same time might not really work. And the kinds of enforcement and things you might want don't really work. So what do we mean by that? So here's a message everyone wants to believe. I work in a business school. I teach classes on business ethics broadly construed, human behavior, why people have conflict, how to reduce it, business-government relations, how to do well by doing good. And everyone really wants to believe this story that if you do the right thing, you'll always make more money, at least in the long run. Maybe not in the short run, but in the long run, you'll always make more money by doing the right thing. It's a really lovely message. Don't we want to believe that it's true? It might not always be true. There might actually be times when justice actually doesn't pay. There might be times when doing the right thing actually costs you something. And you want to be clear as a business school, as a business person, as anyone in any kind of organization, what are you really committed to? Are you committed to doing what's right because it's right? Or are you committed to making money? Are you committed to improving the bottom line? Right? It is nice when what's good and what's right cohere, and sometimes they do. But we also have to recognize sometimes it might come apart, and what do we do about that when they do? Now, this is true of everything. It's true about this issue as well. Nowadays, among many organizations, especially among certain political groups, diversity has become kind of a transcendent value. Every single Fortune 500 company, as far as I can tell, has some sort of diversity initiative. They have something on their corporate social responsibility campaign websites talking about this. They have money being put on this. They have organizations looking at it. As far as I can tell, I looked briefly, it looks like SMU has at least 16 staff in DEI. My own university has more than that. We have a large number of them. Companies often require, and universities as well, DEI statements to be hired. You might have heard how the University of California system, illegally, though I don't think anything will be done about it, was requiring candidates to become a professor like me to have a DEI statement affirming certain kinds of values that would be screened by an HR department before they even ever were sent to faculty for evaluation. Right? So this is a value that's transcendent among many groups. The Democratic Party in their recent platform used this term a lot of times. Now, So does that mean it's a political value? I don't think so. I mean, you're not going to find a lot of people that go, you know what, I'm against diversity, I'm against including people, and I don't like equity either. I like unfairness and homogeneity and exclusivity. Right? A lot of people are going out to say that, right? I mean, it's true people actually do like exclusivity. That's the primary thing that my university sells to its customers is exclusivity. But they don't say that, at least. They don't admit that to themselves, right? So it's a great value. But how do we think about it? What kind of value does it have? What are the arguments for it? Well, one thing I noticed when you look at the literature, when you look at people making arguments about diversity, they make two very distinct kinds of arguments. And you might think, that's great, the more the merrier. Why is it good? Two different kinds of arguments. One is a justice-based argument. The idea is that diversity is required for reasons of justice, because of morality, because it's the right thing to do to have a diverse group, right? So there might be arguments where people think, if you have a large organization, then you should expect, if you have a fully fair system where people have fair equality of opportunity, where they're treated fairly, where there's not discrimination or systematic bias in the institution itself apart from people's attitudes, you might expect that in such an organization that roughly the members of it are going to be proportional to the society at large. And when they're not, then that calls into question, why not? Is it something in the background? Is there systematic bias at the institution? Are people literally discriminating? Is there something else going on? That's a great question, right? But this is an argument about justice, what we owe to people and why we owe it to them, because it's right. Sometimes people have an argument that we know the history of the world is not very nice. Like if you look throughout history, people have acted very, very badly. And as a result, affects how people are going to do in their lives today. Someone like me, because I was born in the United States, makes a certain, I can expect to make a certain level of income for that, but if I'd been born in certain other countries because of their background history, their level of capital development, my income might be 100th of what it is right now, right? We understand that the past has repercussions on the future. What's happening now is partly the result of what happens in the past, and so sometimes people argue that we should make certain kinds of institutional changes in order to compensate and fix those problems. But again, these are moral, justice-based arguments. Sometimes people say that we should have an expressive commitment. You got to put your money where your mouth is. If you're just saying, I care about this, I care about this, I care about this, but you never put any money into it, it's kind of a signal you don't really care about it. So if, for instance, one of my previous deans, not the one who I'm going to have a picture up in a second of, he's a great guy, but one of my previous deans was like, we really care a lot about ethics at Georgetown University. And then one of my colleagues would be like, do you spend any money on it? Do you do anything about it? He's like, no, we just like to have a sign up that says we care about ethics, right? I don't really believe him, right? So similarly, you might think that if you actually care about some things and say that you care about them, you got to put your money where your mouth is and do something with it, right? But these are, again, moral, justice-based arguments. One thing to notice is that all of these arguments are about identity. They're about who you are, what groups you belong to, what race you might have, what gender you have, ethnicity, your religion, and so on, your social class, your economic class. These are identity-based arguments because we know historically lots of people have been mistreated because of what their identity is. Okay, great. What about other kinds of arguments? There's a very different set of arguments you see on behalf of diversity, equity, inclusion that have to do with performance. So the first set of arguments say we should promote DEI because it makes us good, it makes us right. And the second one says we should do it because it makes us money. Now, I have no opposition to making money. I work for money. I don't do a lot of stuff for free. I do some stuff for free. I work for money, you work for money. We all would prefer more rather than having less. There's nothing wrong with that. But notice it's a very different kind of argument. So the argument is, hey, good news, it works. By having diversity within our organization will improve its performance, and that will improve its bottom line, and that will make us and our shareholders and others more money. It will make our departments stronger, it'll make our university stronger, and so on. It'll improve various kinds of metrics that we care about, right? Maybe it will. And there's all sorts of reasons that might be true. Maybe it makes us more productive in some way. Maybe by having a diverse group of people, we have fewer blind spots to what's important. Maybe we see things we otherwise wouldn't see because we have more diversity in our way of thinking. Maybe it leads to better decisions with greater expertise. Maybe it's because two heads are better than one. But notice with this argument, it does not essentially reference anything about identity. It's an open, empirical, scientific question whether what kind of diversity promotes the bottom line. Something that's open to investigation. And lo and behold, in fact, there has been a huge amount of work investigating this. What kind of diversity promotes the bottom line and why? So we'll be talking about that in a little bit. What kind does it? One thing I want to note, though, is already, if you just notice these are two different kinds of arguments, they call for very different kinds of reactions. If something is a matter of justice, if it's a matter of ethics, then there's a reason why activists should care about it, why politicians should care about it, why business ethicists should be writing about it, right? Because it's an ethical issue. It's about right or wrong. However, suppose, contrary to fact, suppose it were simply a matter of money. Suppose diversity did not matter for reasons of ethics. It did not matter for justice-based reasons. Just imagine, instead, all it did was improve the bottom line. Well, there'd be no reason to have any kind of moralistic scolding about it. There'd be no reason to complain about it or have governments involved in it or business ethicists talk about it, because it's not like governments and business ethicists are especially good at making money or knowing how to make profits, right? So by analogy, imagine it turns out that using, say, Google Sheets makes your company more money than using Microsoft Excel. That'd be a really good reason for your business to switch, but it's not a moral reason. It's not something to wag your finger at and get pissed at people when they don't do it. It's just a reason to switch. Further, if it were simply about making more money, if it actually made a lot more money, you'd expect people to do it kind of on their own because the market would force them to. If you have a business and you have a business and you are competing and you have a better method that produces more money, you're going to get investors, not you. People will put capital in you, not you. You will outcompete on the market. You can charge lower prices and have a better quality product, and you'll capture the market, and you'll be forced to copy her practices or die. So imagine it's like your Coca-Cola and your Pepsi. You figure out that using aluminum cans is better than using tin cans because they're less expensive but just as sturdy. You're going to be able to undersell Pepsi. You're going to capture more market share. You'll be forced by the market to conform to what she's doing. And that's true for pretty much any business practice, including whom you hire. So like one of the classic findings in economics is that the market punishes discrimination. That doesn't mean it perfectly stamps it out, but the market has a tendency to do that. The mechanism's pretty much the same as the one I just described. Imagine women are just as good at accounting as men, but I just prefer having men around. Well, what will happen is your salary will probably be lower because people are discriminating against you. But then the greediest capitalists will realize they can make a lot more money just by hiring women. And then they'll capture more profits than everybody else, and they'll tend to drive people out. So that would work. If this were simply a matter of making money, there's no clear reason why this would be a business ethics case. There's no clear reason why universities should have staff working about it, and so on. It has to be about justice. Okay, fair enough. But does that just mean the more arguments, the merrier? Maybe not, because different arguments call for different kinds of enforcement strategies. But there's also another problem. There's a kind of philosophical tension, and that has to do with appealing to self-interest can sometimes be kind of the wrong kind of argument to make. Right? Now, there's a long history in economics of appealing to self-interest. You might not know this, but Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations was the first really important anti-imperialist book. Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations is all about why empires don't pay. They actually cost the country. Smith thought empires were evil, but he basically tried to appeal to people and say, hey, it turns out that the British Empire is not a gold mine on the other side of the Atlantic. It's actually losing us money. Right? I am a defender of something called open borders. I think everyone should be allowed free to move wherever they want, regardless of country. Very, very few people accept that. A lot of economists do. Most other people don't. When I try to defend it, I will try to show people, like the empirics say, that it's actually good for the host country to do it. So I will appeal to self-interest too, but there's still something fishy about it. So here's what I want to point out. Like imagine, have you guys seen the TV show Mad Men? A few of you have, right? So it's like set in the 1960s. You've got this like classic sexist old boys kind of network of marketers. So, and they don't treat the women very well. But imagine we're like a bunch of these good old boys, we mistreat all the women, and we suddenly realize it's not paying off very well. So I make the following kind of argument. I'm like, you know what? Instead of treating the women as sex objects or just as secretaries, we'd actually make a lot of money hiring them as marketers. Well, maybe that's true, but it's also like if you're a woman, you wouldn't feel super comfortable about somebody pushing that argument a lot. You're like, wait a minute. Or Mike, think about what happened in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement and police violence. It's something which I write about. I have works on that particular topic, right? Police violence and so on. Imagine you say to police officers, hey, it turns out that if you respect black lives, your pension will be higher and you'll make more money. It's like maybe that's true, but it's still kind of the wrong argument to make, isn't it? It's like kind of offensive that you're emphasizing that. So these kinds of selfish arguments might convince people to change more than the moralistic arguments, but kind of might be the wrong kind of argument to make. But further, it might actually alienate the very people that you mean to include. Right? So I learned this this is my former boss, David Thomas. He was dean of the business school when I was there. He gave me my chair. And now he's president of Morehouse College. He's one of the scholars that works on this topic. And this is one of the things he found in his own research. When companies push the bottom line argument, they tend to alienate the very people they intend to include. He says, advocates who justify diversity initiatives on the basis of financial benefits may be shooting themselves in the foot. Research suggests that when company diversity statements emphasize the economic payoffs, people from underrepresented groups start questioning whether the organization is really a place where they belong, which reduces their interest in joining it. In addition, when diversity initiatives promise financial gains but fail to deliver, people are likely to withdraw their support for them. He thinks pushing that argument is alienating, and you can kind of see why. Right? Just imagine you've been discriminated against, and I'm just like, we're going to include people like you because it pays. And you're like, I mean, right? You feel it, right? It feels weird, right? And that's what he says. Empirically speaking, it turns out that's what happens. So you got to be really careful with it. It's kind of an uncomfortable argument to make, and in fact, it tends to alienate a lot of people. So is it true? Does diversity improve performance in different kinds of organizations? Maybe. This is something we can investigate. But one thing we want to do is, if you're really doing this as a proper social scientific project, you can't just look at what happens when you have to do real work. And that means things like you want a proper causal model that explains what is the mechanism by which diversity is delivering certain kinds of benefits. You want to have some sort of way of operationalizing what you mean by success. It could mean more publications or more publications in higher level outlets. It could mean more money. It could mean fewer accidents. It could mean all sorts of things that we could count as success. But you want to have something that you can measure, you define and measure carefully. And then you want to go out and actually measure it. You want to see how that thing correlates with the input of diversity, which you also have to very carefully measure. And then you have to control for all sorts of confounding factors. Because as we all know, correlation does not mean causation. Things could correlate with one another and not be causal, right? So for instance, one particular paper I was reading about this said, oh, it turns out there is some evidence that corporate boards with more women have higher performance, but then he looked into the mechanism and says because women would self-select into the higher performing boards, right? So we have to control for that. We can't just, if we just find correlation, we can't just assume that it goes that. So interestingly, some people publish stuff about this and don't take care of this. So there's a report by McKinsey & Company which they have a couple different reports on this, and they're really poor quality. It's embarrassingly bad. I have a lot of negative stories to tell about McKinsey, by the way. Ask me about something called their boxing glove strategy they came up with Allstate at break, and I'll tell you about them. Anyways, they have a couple reports about diversity saying that it pays off, but the reports don't have a causal model. They don't have summary statistics. They don't give us a regression equation. They don't do all the stuff we do as social scientists. They just say, as a matter of fact, companies that are doing better tend to be more diverse, and companies that are doing worse tend to be less diverse. But again, maybe it's causal, maybe causation goes the other way. And they themselves admit this. They say correlation does not demonstrate causation. But then they go on to kind of be duplicitous. They say, well, correlation does not equal causation. The correlation does indicate that when companies commit themselves to diverse leadership, they're more successful. No, it doesn't indicate that. We have to do real social science. By the way, after I published this paper complaining that they didn't have even things like what are called p-values and basic summary statistics, they updated the website, and now it has some of that stuff. I don't know if it's because of me or if they just happened to update it, but I'd like to think that was my fault. But maybe not. I'm not sure if that's that important. So as an analogy, here's something that's true. Graduates of Georgetown University tend to be more successful in business and elsewhere than graduates of Keene State University. I picked Keene State because I'm from New Hampshire, and that's like the kind of weak state university you go to if you weren't very good in high school. All right, so I'm picking on them for that reason. A lot of, I know people, I have friends that went there. It's fine, but so Georgetown students tend to be more successful than Keene State University students on a whole wide range of things that you might count as success. And also, Georgetown's sailing team is significantly better than Keene State's sailing team. That's also true. I'm not making that up. All right. I'm not saying that because I'm a Georgetown person. Our basketball team is terrible. Our football team is terrible. But our sailing team's quite good. Better than Keene State's at least. Therefore, putting money into sailing will make you more successful. Right? You all know, in this case, what direction causation is going. You know that this is a spurious correlation. You know that it's not about that. So similarly, with anything else we might study, we have to be careful. We need a model. We need a way of testing it. We need to gather data. And we have to be careful and control for causation. All right? So what is the best model about diversity out there in the literature? right? It's something called the Hong-Page theorem or the Hong-Page model. This is something I've written extensively about because I work a lot on democratic behavior. How do people and voters interact? How do they reason about politics and so on? How good are they at thinking about politics? And what happens when they work in groups? And this is a theorem that's often been used to talk about diversity in groups and how that helps democracies work better or worse and under what conditions. So their very famous paper says, it's titled just as groups of diverse problem solvers can outperform groups of high ability problem solvers. Here's what they mean. Imagine you have, let's say you're an engineering firm and you want the engineering firm to perform better. You have a problem you want people to solve. One way to make the committee perform better is to get a smarter committee. Right? If everyone's just better, like more competent as an engineer, they might perform better. So like, let's say a group of engineers, 20 engineers, each of whom has an IQ of 130 versus 20 engineers, each of whom has an IQ of 150. You'd probably expect this group to perform better than this group on some engineering problem. Right? So you can make groups better by making them individually more reliable and competent. But the interesting thing they find, or they claim, is that sometimes you can make a group better, not by improving the individual competence of the members of the group, but by having the group be more diverse in a particular way. If they have different sets of skills and mindsets and perspectives, they might see things other people don't do. Just think back to the engineering problem. Engineers have a way of looking at the world. They see the world a certain way. They have certain theorems that they apply. Economists have a way of looking at the world. Philosophers have a way of looking at the world. Managers have a way of looking at the world. Secretaries have a way of looking at the world. We have different skill sets and methods and so on. And so maybe you can make a group behave better and perform better as a whole if there's diverse skill sets and mindsets, and that can in turn lead to better outcomes. So that's what their theorem is about. It's an attempt to mathematically prove this. To be clear, what are they talking about? What aren't they talking about? So an example of something they might mean is, let's say we have a public safety issue. We're like running an automobile company and we're trying to decide how we're going to deal with how safe our cars will be. Well, rather than just having the engineers deal with that problem, maybe we'd get a better solution to the problem if we had a diverse skill set with engineers, marketing professionals, ethicists, production workers, and others who will all see things the other people will miss. And if they can talk and communicate together the right way, we will perform better. Right? Or when you're thinking about having a criminal trial for somebody, like you've been accused of capital murder, do you want 12 people who are all exactly the same and have the same mindset hearing your case? They're probably going to have the same blind spots, the same prejudices, et cetera, et cetera. So you might want a cognitively diverse group of peers. They're more likely to get the right answer. So these are cases where the theorem is applying to it. Here's what it does not mean. They don't mean that every time you have diversity in how people think, this is always going to lead to better results. So some problems might just require a high level of expertise. So they would not be saying something like, if I have some really advanced problem in mathematics, the kind of stuff that gets published in math journals right now, if I take a very diverse group of middle school students, they're going to beat 12 mathematicians who are otherwise identical. No, they're not. They're not going to be able to solve it. The mathematicians are more likely. Some problems might just be too hard for certain people. You need a certain level of expertise to do them. They also would mean things like, if everyone kind of thinks the same way, they're probably not more likely to come up with a solution. So for instance, an odd thing that tends to happen at my university, I don't know if that's true here, but at mine is like DEI problems are all solved by DEI officers. It just goes to the DEI office. Oddly, and kind of paradoxically, that's not what the theorem suggests would work. It suggests it'd be better if you had some DEI officers, plus a bunch of other people who are not DEI officers, who might all see different things. And interestingly, like a lot of the committees are like that. Like, I'm on our free speech committee. It tells you how good our free speech is that we have a free speech committee. In fact, if you Google Georgetown and free speech, you'll see lots and lots of negative things about us. It's not my fault. All right, I'll be clear with that. Our students are actually treated quite well, but the law school's messed up because of Dean Traynor. Yes, I have one. It's good enough free speech that I can point at the camera, and if he sees this later, nothing will happen to me. All right. Yeah, you are bad at free speech, and I judge you harshly for it. All right. So when it comes to our Committee on Free Speech, we have students and administrators from a bunch of different things, and the dean of students, and me, and other faculty members. So we all kind of see and know different things, and we work together differently. But if it were just like 20 philosophers, that'd probably be a problem, right? So they're talking about cognitive diversity, diversity in perspectives. That's the thing that their model says improves performance, at least theoretically, and then they're going to try to test it. What do they mean by that? It means things like this. Diverse ways of representing situations and problems. When you have a skill set, you see the world a certain way. If you are an economist, you see the world as rules that create incentives that change in people's behavior. If you're a sociologist, you see the world as groups that have norms and that change behavior. If you're a psychologist, you see people as brains with quirks, and this changes their behavior. And I'm sure other fields have other things too, but I don't know enough to add them in as an example right now. Right? You see the world a certain way, you divide it up a certain way. Diverse interpretation, what you think is important. What you think is noise and what you think is important depends upon your background theories of the world. You might have a different model. You have different heuristics and ways of trying to solve problems, techniques that you're going to use them, or different predictive models, your ways of judging and guessing what's going to happen. People with diverse perspectives are going to have diversity in all of these different things. And what Hong and Page are arguing is that when people, these diverse perspectives, diverse heuristics, interpretations work together, they can be better than a group that is otherwise homogeneous. It's important, though, to go look at their model a little bit up close. I'm not going to go through the mathematics of it too carefully, but to understand what they're really saying, because it's also going to tell us that managing for diversity and making diversity work is actually a hard thing, right? Which David Thomas taught me that a long time ago, but a lot of people don't seem to realize this. Making it work is actually work. It's not an automatic process. So this is what their model says. It says, imagine a bunch of people who are working together on a problem that's too hard for any one person to solve. Otherwise, you wouldn't need a group anyways. And by the way, this means they actually have to be working together. It doesn't mean if you just put a bunch of people in a room and have them talk, good things happen. It has to be like, we recognize we have a problem and we are trying to solve it. And we all want to solve this problem together, all of us, right? Imagine they say we all have the same value function too. That's going to be important because if what I think the solution to the problem, let's say we're hiring a faculty member and you think we should hire someone who's the best teacher and I think we should hire the best researcher. We care about different things. We're probably not going to work together all that well. We're not going to solve the problem because we have different goals. So imagine we have the same goal, same value function. They also say, imagine each person has only one heuristic or method they use to solve the problem. This is, by the way, unrealistic. Most people have multiple heuristics. As a researcher myself, I have my hands and my background in a bunch of different fields, so I can use different skill sets from different kinds of theories to solve things, and probably all of you are like that in whatever it is you do. Even if you're like a plumber or something, you still have, something about electricity, something about something else. You're using different methods. But for simplicity's sake, they're like, imagine everyone has only one heuristic they use to solve a problem. Imagine further, and this is what they mean by diversity. It's labeled with a mathematical set theory stuff, but this is what diversity means in their theorem. Imagine that whenever one problem solver gets stuck trying to solve a problem, there's always somebody else with a heuristic that can improve upon it. So it's like we're trying to say maximize something and you have an idea and it gets us to here and then you kind of get stuck and then you come into someone else and they have an idea and it gets us up a little bit higher and then you have an idea and it gets us a little more. That's what they mean by diversity. You have something that improves upon a person's current solution. You also, to make this work, people have to be willing to defer to one another's better ideas. Has anyone here ever been in a committee before? In your experience with committees, do people always defer to other people's better ideas? No, right? They don't. Which sucks for me because I always have the good ideas. They really don't. They often don't listen. So this is when cognitive diversity can fail for all sorts of reasons. One thing is, it could just be the problem is too complex for the group to solve or to understand. 20 really diverse, super cognitively diverse middle schoolers are unlikely to solve a problem in advanced mathematics. It's just too hard for them. Maybe 30 years down the line they will, but not right now. It could be the group has conflict and they're not working together. That's surprisingly common, right? So I work on something called deliberative democracy, which is the idea of maybe people will work maybe they'll be better at solving political problems if they deliberate with one another. But the research on this is a real bummer because what it says is when you get people who have diverse politics in a room and have them try to deliberate, they tend to fight and be nasty to each other and get harder and get more extreme and so on. And if they agree to stuff, it's only because they don't want to fight and then they don't even mean it. It's actually quite a big bummer because people don't work together well when it comes to politics. Politics tends to make us mean to each other. It doesn't work so well when the group disputes what counts as a goal. If you're trying to make money and I'm trying to make safety, then we might not be able to solve the problem together because we're not even aiming for the same thing. It doesn't work when the skills just don't function as complements. It doesn't work that well if the group has a systematic bias or a systematic mistake or a systematic way of thinking about things, right? That won't fix it. It also won't work if the group is cognitively uniform but demographically diverse. A rainbow of people who think exactly the same way is not predicted on this model to improve anything. That doesn't mean that identity doesn't matter as a form of diversity for this. It matters when it ends up being a proxy for cognitive diversity, which sometimes it is. And we'll see that in some of the research we're going to talk about in a second, like the empirical research testing this in similar kinds of models. But a rainbow of people who have the same skill set, same way of thinking, same mindset, same model of the world, but look very different is not predicted to improve group performance. But hey, maybe empirics work out differently. So Scott Page, who's one of the gurus of this big theorem, this is the big theory of diversity out there in the literature, he has this really cool book called The Difference. And after about 300 pages outlining this model in painstaking detail and really looking through the complexities of it, he finally gets to, what do all the empirical research, what did decades of science say when we actually try to test this with data? And this is what he says. He's like, the benefits of diversity exist, they're not huge. And we can walk away, that's it. This is the guru of diversity, and that's what he's saying. And further, it's going to turn when demographic diversity helps, it really is, empirically speaking, because it is a proxy for cognitive diversity, which sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. The benefits of diversity exist, they're not huge. Now, in this, I go through many studies, including what are called meta-studies. Meta-studies are there's been 90 papers published on something, and then you go and review them all and see if they have a systematic answer to things. I'm not going to go through and read all of the answers to you now, but I'll talk about some of the examples of the empirical research on this that people have found. So for instance, Paul Guest in a 2019 British Journal of Management paper says, he examines whether diversity in corporate boards leads to better monitoring outcomes, such as CEO compensation, reduced accounting misstatements, CEO turnover performance, acquisition performance, a bunch of other things. He looks at about 2,000 firms with about 12,000 observations and about 15,000 directors over a pretty long period, right? And what he generally finds is that as an independent variable, diversity of a bunch of different sorts of demographic diversity had very trivial results. Sometimes it was slightly negative, sometimes it was slightly positive, sometimes it was neutral, and in general the results were not statistically significant. Now if you're not a stats person, you might be like, what the hell does that mean? What it means is you're being really careful and you're trying to see, the results we're getting, are they big? No. And are they possibly the result of chance? Yeah. We can't distinguish them from chance. As an independent variable controlling for other confounds, it basically has no real effect. O.C. Richard has a famous paper from 2000. He looks at 574 banks in California, Kentucky, and North Carolina. The reason he uses banks is because, I'm not here to play up banking regulation. We know what's happening this week. But nevertheless, banks have relatively similar reporting requirements. So then when you look at a report from one bank and another, it's relatively easy to compare them because they're sort of forced to talk the same way. So what you mean by this, what you mean by that are the same thing. Makes it easier to do a cross comparison. And they're forced to publicly report this in a consistent manner. So he looks at whether racial diversity is correlated with firm performance while controlling for these other confounding variables, such as the age of the firm, the size of the firm, and other things. And he finds that it has no statistically significant effect on firm performance. Right? David Carter and his co-authors looked at 500 S&P 500 firms from 1998 to 2002. Same result, no significant relationship between gender and ethnic diversity of the board or the gender and ethnic diversity of major corporate committees or on financial performance. There's a bunch of studies looking at this in Italy. Same result. Doesn't really seem to do much. There's a number of studies that are done in Spain looking at this. Gender diversity of corporate boards, ethnic diversity of corporate boards. Generally no effect on corporate performance on the stock exchange and other things. However, this is when it starts to get interesting. One very persistent finding in a lot of these studies is ethnic diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, in and themselves don't have much of an effect up or down on performance. But what does, national diversity. From being from a different country, hiring CEOs and others from different countries. And you think back to that Hong-Page theorem, you're like, that kind of makes sense, right? Because being from a different country means you're probably from a different culture, which means you probably have a different way of looking at the world, right? You're going to have a different set of mindsets and so on. You're probably going to have different biases and different strengths. Right? So over and over, you keep finding this, the fact that you look different from me doesn't matter, but you grew up in a very different place does. Right? So that's what's going to matter. That is when this starts being a proxy for cognitive diversity, is when you really do have a different mindset because you grew up in a very different place with a different way of looking at the world. Farrell and Hersh did a meta-analysis looking at about 3,100 companies. Half the companies were from developing countries and half were not. They claim the performance of women on corporate boards is not related to firm financial performance once you control for other confounding variables. Casper Rose Similar thing, looks at Denmark, gets very similar results. And one of the reasons he says, when he actually like gets into why you don't get any real results, he says, it turns out when you really measure like female corporate board members, they have pretty much the same mindset as the male corporate board members. They think the same way, they have the same problem-solving skills, they're not really thinking any differently. And in the paper that you have, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of other studies. And there's really, the interesting thing is, in the empirical literature in management theory, this is generally what people have been saying for the past 30 years. It's actually surprising how much of a disparity there is between what people say out there and what they say in the journals. That's one of the reasons why when I was writing this and I submitted it to a business journal, they were like, you're being so nice to the other side. Like, you should really go for the blood, because interestingly, the journals are fairly negative on this. It's like, it's an interesting thesis. Does having a rainbow of people who think the same way help? And the answer is no, it doesn't. But nevertheless, that's what we talk about. I'm going to go back to David Thomas and his co-author Robin Ely. They wrote a very famous paper in Harvard Business Review back in the 90s arguing for the business case for diversity. And then they recently published a paper responding to their own paper, and they basically said, you all misunderstood us. You did not understand what we said. We had this paper arguing that you can make diversity work, but it really does take work. So they say, like, increasing diversity, is a quote from David, like, increasing diversity does not by itself increase effectiveness. It is not this automatic magic pill, you take it and all of a sudden you're more effective. He says, scholarly researchers have rarely found that increased diversity leads to improved financial performance. You don't usually get that result. They say also, it often causes conflict, which undermines performance. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. What they actually were saying is, in the original article, which everyone ignored, they just like said, diversity can help, and they ignored all the other stuff they said, is you can make diversity work if what you do is have a proper management system that draws out the different knowledge and skill sets and background of different people to get them to work together, to complement one another's biases, to improve performance. And that is a hard managerial problem. And managers were like, that does sound like a hard problem, so let me ignore it and just hear diversity is good, and that's easy. Because that's easy. It's easy to hire people that look different. It's hard to manage people for diversity, and so most people don't even try, right? What about cognitive diversity? And when you look at the papers out there in the empirical literature, in management theory, and other kinds of things, you find over and over again kind of confirmation of the Hong-Page theorem. Cognitive diversity as an independent variable does predict better performance. When people think differently and have different skill sets, it does predict better performance. But even then, the results are fairly modest. It's not a magic thing that just doubles your company's profits. We're talking about a couple parts of a percent. And the reason for that is because diversity, making diverse people work together is actually kind of hard. You know, we're at a university. This is like a really good example of how universities work. They're called universities. It evokes the idea of a universe. But like, I've been at Georgetown for 12 years. So when I'm walking across campus, parents will come up to me and ask me like the name of a building. Like, do you know where I can't even come up with one because I don't know the names of them. Do you know where the so-and-so building is? And I'm like, nope, don't. Why not? Because I'm normal. And what happens when you're a professor like me is you like go to your building and like one other building, and that's it. Like, I don't go hang out with the sociology department. I don't go hang out with the theology department. Like, I talk to don't talk to people in the law school. You're just hanging out with your people all the time. And when I do talk to them, they seem like aliens. It's like weird. I'm like, why are you like, sociologists, why are you so into Durkheim? Like, who cares about Durkheim, what he has to think about the world? Like, you should be drawing supply and demand curves and using that to, like, even in universities where we have all this expertise, people are in these little enclaves and they barely ever talk to each other. And when you ask them why that is, they'll be like, I agree, other people should listen to us, but I don't have much to learn from them. It turns out that this kind of mindset among professors is surprisingly common. Engineers think they know everything. And they know a lot, but they don't. Marketing professionals think they know everything. Managers think they know everything, et cetera, et cetera. The corporate ethicists think they know everything. Everyone thinks they know everything, and they don't listen to other people very well. That's kind of how we are. But nevertheless, when you can so trying to get diverse people with diverse perspectives to work together is surprisingly hard. Experiments trying to make it work often don't work out because of that. People are kind of pig-headed. It gets worse, though. So I'm going to tell you some stuff that's a real bummer. I cover this a lot with my students in class, and I'm really upset. It bothers me that this is a consistent finding in the empirical research. One thing about human beings is that they're kind of terrible. They're really quite awful. I teach a class called Managing Flawed People for freshmen at my school, And it's all about why is it good people of goodwill do bad things, and what explains that? And at the end of the semester, my students are genuinely bummed out, right? In fact, I did an experiment with them. This isn't an aside where I said to them, all right, here's a $50 bill. I'm going to hide it in a certain place on campus. I showed them exactly where it was going to be in the building. It was behind a painting. And I said, if this $50 bill is still there at the end of the semester, all of you get 2 extra credit points in your final grade. So if you have an 89, you have a 91. But if anyone wants to take it, you can just take it. And I will never ask who took it, and we will never reveal that. It's a little game to see how much you trust each other and how much you're willing to work for the common good. Right? And also I said, just to be clear, you can't take the money and put it back the last day. I'm going to check it periodically, so if it's ever missing, it's gone. I took a picture of the number and so on to make sure they couldn't replace it with another bill. Guess how long it lasted? It was gone that night. To be clear, maybe what I do works because I did it with a sophomore class, and they actually made it last the entire semester, and they got the extra credit points. So good job, sophomores, bad job, freshmen. My students were really bummed out about this as they're learning about flaws in human nature. Here's one of the many flaws about human nature. People do not like being around people that are different from them. In general, they don't. And they get uncomfortable. They don't like it. They don't trust people as much when they're seen as different and so on. This is especially true, by the way, of politics. That's where it's the worst. It didn't used to be, but now that's the worst thing. No one wants to interact with people with different politics. So how do we know this? Well, there's a bunch of different games and things economists can do to test this theory, to see what makes people more trusting of one another or not. So there's a game called the trust game. Here's how the game works. You play with 2 people who do not know each other and will never interact with each other. You oftentimes don't even put them in the same room. You do it by computer. Before they play the game, you make sure they really do understand the rules of the game, because you don't let them play if they don't understand, because it's about how they react. All right? Then you give one player $10. And you say, first player, however much money you want, you can share with the second player. I always pick the people closest to me in my examples, so you win. You can play you get $10, however much you want, you can share with the second player. However much you give him, I will multiply by 3. So when you get the money at the end, if you get $30, you know he gave you all 10. If you get 3, you know he sent 1. You know that he said, I don't trust you. Right? After you send it to that second player, that player can do whatever they want with the money, including sending you as much back as they want. If people are fully trusting and trustworthy, the game will go like this. You'll give them all the money, and you'll give them half back. That is the ideal result. Once you have this, and there's other games like this, but that's my favorite one, that test for these kinds of things. And you can go around the world, and in fact, economists, not me, but other economists have gone around the world seeing what kinds of factors influence how people play this game. Things like sleep deprivation, watching a scary movie, spraying certain hormones into your nose, having you stand in an awkward position for 10 minutes and then do it. All sorts of things affect this. What about diversity? How do people play when they're diverse? Guess what? I told you human beings suck, right? So what happens is the more similar someone is in the game to you, overall, the more likely you are to trust them, and also the more likely you are to give the money back. The more you see them as different, the less trusting you tend to be of them. Some places are worse than this than others, by the way. This is not when I say that's the general finding, it's not consistently the same strength everywhere. Some places diversity doesn't matter as much as others, but generally speaking, people trust each other when they see themselves as being the same. And in fact, there's a crap ton of research on this in economics on this very point. There's a very famous paper about the size of the American welfare state, for instance, that says one reason it tends to be smaller than in Europe is because of diversity versus homogeneity. People tend to assume that people who are different from them will tend to not be trustworthy, and they're less willing to invest in them. So there's a new paper that came out on this. It did a systematic review of 1,001 trust estimates from 87 studies, and they say, we find a statistically significant negative relationship between ethnic diversity and social trust across all studies. The relationship is stronger for trusted neighbors, and when ethnic diversity is measured more locally, covariate, we won't get into that, what it means. To be clear, when I report this to you, because sometimes when people report the results of research, they're like, oh, you think this is a good thing. I actually think this sucks. I think this is a really bad thing. And here's why it sucks for me ideologically. I mentioned before, I'm an open borders person. This is an objection to my own view. This is a problem that my view has. Yeah. By the way, it is worth noting the effect size is not huge. Generally speaking, it's not a gigantic thing. It's not like trust just as soon as there's diversity. But it is true that in general, diversity leads to decreased trust. Why does that matter for the Hong-Page theorem? Well, think about what that theorem was saying. This is our best account of why diversity can make groups behave better. Groups work together when they have a different set of skills and perspectives, and they listen to one another, and they hear the other person's point of view, and they accept it, and they learn from each other. But if they see it like, you're different from me, I don't trust you, and you think the same thing, we don't work together as well. We're not as trusting. We are less likely to have the same values and so on. So we're less likely to work together well. So again, managing flawed people. This is a bummer that people are like this. But when I talk about this, this is not me endorsing this any more than if Stanley Milgram were here talking about how people will shock each other like pretty easily. Right? It's just a bummer of what we find. So what this means is that David Thomas is right. There's not a free lunch here when it comes to diversity. There's a big appetite for a free lunch. People would like to think it's just this easy thing. This is not just about diversity, by the way. This is true about a lot of things. One of the former deans we had wanted to have like ethics as a kind of brand for the university and for the business school in particular. And he was talking to my colleague, and it was like, well, he really just wanted to have a platitude that he could write on the board as if he were in a Dilbert comic that didn't say anything, it didn't mean anything, it didn't cost us anything. It's like, it sounds good as long as you don't think about it, that kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, they want the free lunch. So why is there a big appetite for free lunch and diversity? I think partly because there's oftentimes pressure to hire for diverse groups because of the justice-based concerns. Right? I'm not denying that, but it's just a different reason. I think sometimes there's a desire to seem good to certain people, and that might push you to go a certain way. I think sometimes it's because there's, generally speaking, a love of intellectual orthodoxy and a discomfort with disagreement. One of the most persistent findings in research on political behavior is people do not like to be around people with whom they disagree about any kind of political issue, or generally with people they disagree about much of anything. If you want to read one really good book on this, it's called Hearing the Other Side by the political scientist Diana Mutz. Right, it's a great book. But she finds people do not want to work with people that they disagree with, and they will, if they can afford to avoid it, they will. That's especially true of like upper middle class people, by the way. They are the worst on this. Blue collar people are much better. Interesting, isn't that? There's discomfort with that. So people kind of like the idea of hiring diversity, but a lot of people kind of think the same. Right? They kind of push for the wrong sort of diversity. They want to be surrounded by like-minded people who maybe look different, but are like-minded. Plus, just from a management perspective, wouldn't it be nice if the benefits were automatic? Like if I were a dean, I'd love it if I could just hire a diverse workforce and then magic happens and everything's great. And I don't have to actually put any work into training them, into getting them to deliberate together, into getting them to talk with one another. That's work. That's real work. I don't want to do that. I'd rather just hire people and hope magic happens. Lots of managers think that way, and not just in schools and in business and elsewhere. Of course they want the free lunch. I want a free lunch. I think I'm going to get taken to dinner, and I'll be free. But even that's being paid for by somebody, right? It's never a free lunch. There's always a cost. Diversity costs something. So to summarize everything we've said here, there's a justice-based case for having diversity. It is not to be confused with the performance-based case for diversity. They're different things. The theory empirics of the business case largely show that it's about cognitive diversity. Identity-based or demographic diversity can be important when it functions as a proxy for cognitive diversity. And it sometimes does. Right? You can make it do that. David Thomas, he's like, you can make it do that, but you have to actually look for it. You can't just assume it's there. A rainbow of people who think the same way is not cognitive diversity. It's just a different kind of diversity, which again, there might be a real argument for it, but it's a justice-based argument. It's not a cognitive argument. Further, managing cognitive diversity is a hard task. When you really look at that Hong-Page theorem and what it says, what does it take to make it work? It's not automatic. It requires us listening to one another, having different perspectives, learning from one another, talking to one another carefully, sharing values and aiming towards the same goal, having a real problem that we're working on. That's not a given. You've been in committees. You've seen that fail over and over and over again. And finally, because of the difficulty of making it work, even when it comes to cognitive diversity, the measured benefits of it are relatively modest. They're not gigantic. The guru himself says it's modest. Right? So that's, I think, at the end of the day, that is the truth about this. So with that, I hope if you are going to have a diverse workforce, you'll take this and be more careful about how you manage things. We have like, what, 10 minutes? Yeah, so you got like about 10 minutes for comments, questions. And there's microphones there. Shure SM58s. Those are actually very good microphones for singing, so feel free to sing if you'd like.
It's a great talk, thanks. I'm an engineer, so I don't claim myself to be, the smartest. Actually, there's I remember when I built my house, the builder first question asked, about myself is, what's your profession? Okay, I really didn't understand why he would ask that, but then he told me with that, he will know what the next 6 months will be for him. But he did tell me that from his experience, the smartest profession is neurosurgeon. Okay, so engineer is not on the top of this list. But yeah, I agree with you. Engineers, marketing people look at things different. But even within like the engineering profession, different types of engineers, they bring in different perspectives. So even in my line of work, when we form a team, even though we're all electrical engineers, each one of us usually have different skill sets and different backgrounds, and so that makes the team a lot better than just hiring everyone from MIT. And so it's kind of, I see the perspective there. One question that I would like to ask, maybe it's not easy to frame it, but the particular question that I have is, sorry, when I look at this this legislation on the trying to remember the point? No. It's not that. Sorry. See, engineers think different. Yeah. The reduction of the scholarship. Yeah, the waiving of the scholarship thing. The two sides both claim they are based on moral judgment and economics reason. I mean, they both argue the same way. So how do you explain the seemingly equal sets of arguments, but obviously on two different ends?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you put it that way, because one way to think about this is we have a tendency in politics to assume, we all have this kind of simple model of politics that goes like, when I do politics, I aim for justice and good, and the other people just care about their pocketbook and they're just evil assholes, and that's all they care about. And in fact, there are evil assholes out there, managing flawed people, right? But generally people mean well and they want to make things right, but they disagree about what's right. And I'm not here to talk about the particular sets of legislation that's being proposed in Texas right now about regulating public universities and their hiring or so on. I'm not an expert in that by any means. But I do think when it comes to this issue, I think a lot of disagreement comes about what do you think of the empirics are, but also like what metaphors or analogies you use to think about like inequality. So like you'll often see things like, just as a sample of this, because this is such a big topic, I can't answer it in even an hour. But like when people think about unequal outcomes and how some people do well and some people do better, I'm at a school with a lot of extremely privileged people who grew up with like a silver spoon. And then there are people who aren't. I have like students I mentor who come from like a working class background, and that they feel weird there, right? But they're going to have some. When you think about diverse outcomes and changes in outcomes, like oftentimes people have this metaphor. They go, imagine like society is like a race. Like we're all trying to run a race, and like some people are on like a conveyor belt that just moves them along and brings them right into Princeton, and then like right to their job at Goldman Sachs, and then to their yacht club. And other people have every possible conceivable hurdle in the way, and then there's like everything in between, And then they go, when people have unequal outcomes, if it's because of unequal starting points and unequal obstacles, isn't that really horrific? And then other people object to that and go, look, putting unfair obstacles in front of people is a bad thing. Poverty is a bad thing, but society is not a race. A race has to be equal because we're trying to measure performance. Society, as the left-wing philosopher John Rawls said, is a mutual venture for a cooperative gain. We're not all trying to get to the same destination. Your gain does not come as my loss. And I really think when this particular issue, a lot of the disagreement comes from what metaphor people think best, or analogy best explains the ethics of our differences. If you see it as, we're on a conveyor belt and you have an unfair advantage, then you're going to like rail against any inequality in outcomes. If you see it as something else, you might not. That's just a taste of like a response to that. I know it's not enough, but I think it's a really important question. And to be clear, this paper, I really don't get into the specifics of these philosophical arguments, but it is true that everything I put up there as all this stuff about justice, in the philosophy literature, there is a massive literature in all this with people taking very different perspectives on it and disagreeing with a lot of this stuff too, right? Even people in the same political side, right? So yeah, there's a massive amount of disagreement here, and I don't know how you would resolve it. I find that when I get up and argue about ethics, I don't usually convince most people, so it's not me either. Yeah, please go ahead.
Great talk, thank you. On the diversity categories, are there any studies on how much it matters if in the diverse group they're religious, and then another person that's religious but just a different, so it doesn't really challenge, versus an atheist comes in or in any way challenges, right? There's a difference between there's diversity, but they're not really, I've got to defend my position. Are there any studies on that, how much the pushback is and how much the, hey, get out of our group is?
Yeah, that's a great question. The studies that are out there that I saw, and I tried to read them all, but there's so many, looking at corporate performance, didn't even test religiosity.
Right.
However, the trust game does. And generally speaking, you find actually kind of a weird results. Some of the studies say what you'd expect. People are less trusting of people who are different religion from them. But there are a couple studies, oddly, that say that people, generally speaking, trust religious people more than non-religious people, and even atheists playing the trust game will be more likely to give you the money if they've been told you're religious. That's an interesting result. They might think, well, you think God is watching, right? So you think you're going to get punished if you don't play well. So there are some studies that say that people are, generally speaking, more trusting of religiosity, and there's really a good mechanism for this. If you think about, there's kind of a signaling function to religion. This is not to say religion is only about this. It's definitely not. But there is sort of a signaling function. And it has a lot to do with like how engagement rings work. You know, like, so back in 2002, I gave my then girlfriend a very expensive engagement ring that I didn't really have the money to afford. Why did I do that? I'm like, because I talked about maybe getting married beforehand. We're like driving in the car, like we should get married. But I gave her a ring and asked her to marry me. Why does that work? Because the fact that I was willing to spend thousands of dollars on a trinket, this is my wedding ring, it's just cheap, but like her nice ring, was proof to her that I'm really committed, right? And so one of the things that religiosity does is by engaging in certain kinds of rituals and having certain kinds of belief that are kind of expensive rituals, like, you know, you can't drink this now, you can't eat this now, you have to go here now, and so on, or believing things that are not readily apparent. You know, no religion is focused on the sky being blue and the ground being hard. It's always about some supernatural stuff that's not obvious to people. The fact that you do that signals to other people that you are committed to the group and that you're pro-social, right? And so, when, in fact, you find religiosity tends to make people cohere together more. So, interestingly, I think that's why some of these trust studies with the trust game say that even non-religious people trust religious people more. But that said, generally speaking, a Christian's more likely to trust a Christian, a Muslim's more likely to trust a Muslim, a Jewish person's more likely to trust a Jewish person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
You make the premise that diversity doesn't really improve the bottom line, which is, understand that. Is there a penalty, though, if a company decides, well, then I'm really not going to worry about diversity? Is there a financial cost to them, maybe in moral hazard and other kinds of things? The flip side, it may not help them, but is there a penalty to it if they don't?
There might be now, but it's kind of, it might be an odd sort of penalty. So it works something like this. Imagine like most people want you to be, your company to have a Christian board. And then we find out your board isn't Christian, so we boycott you. There'd be a penalty to not having a Christian board, but it wouldn't be because, in this example, Christians are particularly good at running the company. It's just because if you don't have those people, we'll be mean to you. And so I think nowadays there's a thing where people, at least some people in the US and other countries, want you to have a diverse workforce, want you to have a diverse board, et cetera, and will shy away from or shun your company if you don't. So you might get punished for it that way. When I say punished, I'm not therefore saying it's a bad thing. Maybe you should be punished. Maybe it's a matter of justice, and they should do that to you. But there are some studies that say there's a negative effect because of that. But notice it's different from like there being a downside that's intrinsic to it. It's about how people react to you, right? But generally speaking, you know, there are some studies that say that it helps, but generally speaking, it's just like the effect is really small. It might be a little negative, might be a little positive. it just doesn't seem to matter that much intrinsically. So that doesn't mean, like, should you pursue it? Well, there's a whole set of arguments for pursuing it here. It's just different from those arguments. You know? And if you really care about this, if you really think this is important, then why do you need that? You know? Like, imagine if I say to my 11-year-old, you shouldn't lie to people, and he goes, but Dad, does it pay? Does it pay not to lie? It's like, actually, I have a whole set of classes I can teach you on that, right? I have a game we can play. I got all sorts, but it's the wrong question, right? Yeah, please go ahead.
If you put aside the justice-based arguments and just focus on performance, and if the only way to make DEI work is to do it, really put a lot of energy and time and effort into it, it sounds like it's not worth it. Is there a study that actually deals with the costs of trying to make it work? It's one thing to say it takes a lot of effort to make it work, which maybe it does. But if it does take a lot of time and effort and the benefits are small, then it would seem that's foolish effort unless you're going to make justice-based arguments.
I mean, that might be the case, but even then, if you just model a company as profit maximizing and say, you know, you wouldn't leave money on the table. So if putting, let's just say time and effort is money. So let's say it costs our Fortune 500 company $1 million worth of time and effort, but to make it work the right way. But the result is we get 1.4 million back. We make $400,000 profit. That's pretty modest, but it's still, that's money on.
The question is, are the costs greater than that? If the benefit is, the cost is $1 million and the benefit is $1.4 million, you do it. My question is, do we know that the costs are less than the benefit?
Yeah, I guess we kind of do because the studies that are on the cognitive performance, they're not actually controlling for how hard do you work to make it work, right? So you're kind of looking at, here are all the companies out here, all of them, and overall the relationship is cognitive diversity improves performance, improves the bottom line, right? So that means the companies that are like sucking at it and not putting in the effort, they're already getting captured in this and you're getting a result. So in a sense, I agree with Paige, just like, it's not automatic. There might be times when it's not worth it. There might be times when it's too hard to make it work, but you can, and it's probably worth it if you do. But again, we're talking about diversity in our way of thinking, not diversity in our way of looking.
Do they talk about the numbers? Like, is 10% of it works, or 90% works, or 80%?
Yeah, that is a good question, and honestly, I don't know off the top of my head if there's like a real answer to that. Yeah, it's a good question, but yeah, I don't know. Because you're right, because if it's like 90% of the time it fails, but the other 10% gets such high results. I think actually in general what you find is most companies make it work and it's a pretty modest result. I think that's a pretty good summary of it. Yes?
Great energy, great
All right.
presentation.
Oh, and you have the last question, so
Thanks.
please make it an inclusive and diverse one.
I hope it's a good one. On the cognitive side, you know, different personalities, Myers-Briggs think differently.
Yeah.
I think a lot differently than my wife or my daughter does my son. Do you see gender diversity adding performance to
Good
the
question.
argument?
You might think that because, yeah, you might think maybe men and women have a different perspective on the world. There's psychology studies saying that there's systematic differences. Like, you know, it's overlap, but like the curves are moving when it comes to men and women on like personality traits and so on. But these studies, there's a lot of studies on gender diversity in corporate boards and a bunch of measures of performance. And generally they say the same thing, no effect, and if there is an effect, it's small and not statistically significant. So one possibility, a couple of studies looked into this carefully, and they said part of the reason is because, you know, Goldman Sachs hires a certain kind of person who thinks a certain way, and they screen for that. And the people also, it's not just like the hiring, the selection process of the company itself, it's you, the person going to work at a place. Where do you choose to work? People self-select into places where they feel at home and avoid places where they feel alien. And that includes not just how I look and who's there, but how people think about things and how they solve problems. There's a reason why, even if Harvard's sociology department contacted me tomorrow and was like, do you want to come work at Harvard sociology? I'd like to work at Harvard, but I would say no, because I don't want to be in a sociology department. I really don't. No offense to sociologists, but I'm glad you're over there. So that kind of dynamic happens with workers too. So there's a selection process where we try to take people who think our way, and the people who think our way are more likely to apply and more likely to take the job if they get it. So I think that's probably the reason. So even though there are, you know, empirically measurable, systematic differences between men and women, again, not all men and women are different, but just for any particular measure, the curve might be like this here, this for men and this for women or something. You actually get pretty modest results, and I suspect that's the reason.
Good, thanks.
Onward.
We have a free lunch available outside.